Tonight for dinner discussion, I think you'll find this gentleman fascinating, and we're delighted to have him. But what I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to ask you to indulge me, and I'm going to ask Dave Olson to come up and make the introductions, and then we'll move on from there. Thank you, Dave.
It's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Dr. Boris Schucht. Boris is the CEO of 50 Hertz, the transmission system operator in Eastern Germany. He is a nuclear engineer who went to work at a lignite burning company and has transformed it into a renewable energy company. Under his leadership, 50 Hertz was awarded the Platts Energy Award last year as the most innovative electricity company of the year. So, if you have your ISO Today app, you can see that California has 6,000 megawatts of wind and 7,000 megawatts of solar. Well, Germany has 35,000 megawatts of wind and 37,000 megawatts of solar. With that much solar, the solar eclipse last March becomes a pretty exciting event. 50 Hertz has about a third of that amount of PV. So as the eclipse occurred, 50 Hertz lost 8,000 megawatts of wind, of solar very, very quickly. And then as the eclipse passed, it got 15,000 megawatts of solar in a matter of a few minutes. So quite a ramp like we have never seen. So Boris is such a good manager and trusts his operators so much that during the eclipse, he went to play golf. Or at least so I am told. Please help me welcome Dr. Boris Schucht.
Yeah, thanks, David. After this introduction, I should go home, actually. It cannot become better. Yeah, dear David, ladies and gentlemen, thanks a lot for this kind introduction, and thanks a lot for this inspiring and exciting tour this week in California. As you have heard, we are already a few days on the road, and it will continue tomorrow. So we are very much looking forward for that. When I look back 15 years, when I was a young engineer in an integrated utility, and somebody asked us, is it possible to integrate more than 5% solar and wind power safely into the system? All experienced engineers said, no way. We will face serious problems and reliability will go to hell. So, David, I'm sure this is the reason why you have asked me to talk to you as today a little bit more experienced engineer. But now, seriously. Today, David introduced already myself and the company a little bit. I'm proud to serve a company which has proven in the last years that the transformation into a renewable-dominated world is possible. And I'm very proud that 50 Hertz, as a TSO in Eastern Germany, plays an important role in this interesting and challenging project. As Dave already mentioned, 50 Hertz is one of the German TSOs covering roughly 1/3 of Germany. And with the German Energiewende, we are currently really in the middle of the biggest industrial transformation project since the reunification. It's a real big transformation. What makes 50 Hertz different from many others is the early and massive development of renewables especially wind power in our region. In our region, the northeast of Germany, we have already, as you mentioned, in total 25 gigawatt of renewables installed, compared to a conventional fleet of roughly 20 gigawatt and a peak load of about 16 gigawatt. You can 25 to 16. That illustrates the dominant role of renewables already today in our system that we have to manage every day. Let me shortly point out also some German figures, because it's also important. David, I have to correct you a little bit. Sorry about that. It's not 35 and 37. It's both above 40 today because we are still building. Your numbers were from end of last year. So with a total consumption of 600 terawatt hours, that is roughly double as much as California. California has 300 terawatt hours. We have today 40 gigawatt of wind and 40 gigawatt of solar and roughly 10 gigawatt of other renewables, mainly biomass, so 90 gigawatt of renewables. A minimum load in the country of 35 gigawatt and a maximum load of 38. You can imagine, with this amount of renewables, we already often meet the minimum consumption of the country. This leads to a situation where in the 50 hertz region, more than 42% of the consumption is today already covered by intermittent renewables, volatile renewables. To my knowledge, there's no other region with a comparable high share of volatile renewables in the world. Some people say the German Energiewende or the German energy transition is a big and uncertain experiment. Using this picture, 50 hertz grid region is a laboratory of this experiment. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's why I would like to share today some insights and some lessons learned from this big experiment in the eastern part of Germany. The first question is, what were our general lessons learned in integrating renewables so far? We often hear from foreign delegations visiting us that they are afraid of the effect of wind and PV in the system, and that they discuss about the volatility and all this. And the discussion here today shows that it's also an issue here in California. Today I can tell you, just go for it. The system and the involved parties will learn step by step how to cope with the rising share of renewables. In our development, we could identify there are three major phases, which I want to explain to you a little bit. In the first phase, renewables had a share up to 5 to 10%. They were a kind of niche product. We learned to live with them. We learned on how to develop forecast systems and these kind of things. But in this phase, errors had no major impact on the overall system. So in practice, this was a learning phase. You could just ignore the renewable energies. You have gone through this phase, I think, here in California also already. In the second phase, that's a phase between 10 and 40% renewables in the system, they become a major player, a major source in the system. What was important in our case in this phase? The regulation around the renewables needed to change. For example, curtailment had to be allowed, and we had to train how to use it. We had to learn how to curtail renewables. Forecasting models had to get much more accurate, especially on weather forecasting. And we also had to implement procedures how to steer in a certain way renewables via the market, but also technically via our control centers. We had to make first steps to integrate renewables in the market. What does it mean? Renewable generators were forced to sell their production on the wholesale market via the power exchange. So we moved from a pure feed-in tariff system to a market premium system. But we also learned that the existing systems offer much more flexibility than we ever expected. In this phase, with 10 to 40% renewables, there was clearly enough flexibility in the system every day and every second. We also learned that a strong and interconnected grid is of very high importance, and that we rapidly had to start to think of the infrastructure of the future. And not only in Germany, that's true for whole Europe. Now, 50 Hertz moved into the third phase where the renewable share is above 40%, where renewables are the dominant source in the systems. They now set the scene. What is now needed to integrate this huge share of renewables safely? New market products closer to real time are needed. We introduce, for example, the quarterly hour products close to real time. We may see even shorter products in the future. I have heard that you have here already 5 minutes products implemented. Renewables have to take over a role in keeping the system stable. Ancillary services can also be provided by renewables. And finally, a new market design is progressively coming. A market design more linked to the effects and the needs of the renewables than to the conventional generation. Demand side becomes more important. We have heard a lot about that, and I think that's true for all regions in the world. We are not very good in Europe and in Germany on that yet. The grid extension and the connectivity of regions and nations is one of the most important issues. But differently than the discussion here today, new types of storage or more storage becomes in our grid and in Europe and Central Europe only an issue when we reach a market share of renewables of 70% or even higher. That means we need storage, but we don't need it now. We need it later in maybe 15, 20 years. And we expect electricity, heat, and gas to converge more and more. For example, power to heat is already something which we see in several elements in our system. And I'm sure that's not the end of the story. I've seen today this nice picture of the duck curve, and I think I have to spend a word on the duck curve. The question is, do we have a duck curve in Germany? Yeah, you could expect we have so much renewables, we should have a duck curve. Well, I feel tonight a little bit like a lame duck with my feet, but we don't have a duck curve in Germany. Even with a higher share of wind and solar power, already today, we don't have a duck curve. Why is that the case? I tried to understand it. I had several discussions on that in the last days. Of course, there are times with overshooting renewable productions. On our numbers that I explained before, and you can imagine that's the case. But how do we manage to handle this? First of all, we are physically strongly interconnected and have huge investment programs in place to increase the connectivity within and between the regions. That means for whole Europe, we have an investment program in grids of 200 billion euro in the next years. 50 Hertz in itself has something around 6 billion in the years. I think TenneT represented today here is maybe the double of that. Yeah? So we are heavily investing in grid extension to transport energy from the from the renewables to the consumer centers. That's why the grid extension is seen in Europe as the most important success factor for the energy transition. Grids must connect renewable centers with the consumer centers and with the storage regions. We are, for example, building new interconnectors between Scandinavia and Germany to connect the huge hydro reservoirs as potential natural storage or flexibility resources. And Auke Lond, our colleague from Statnet, is the one who is heavily investing in these interconnectors. Besides that, we intensively work on the commercial integration of the different regions. We are therefore aiming for a single European electricity market. Dave mentioned that this morning. And we already reached a well-coupled market via market coupling schemes between the different market regions today. Our neighboring states, for example, can buy pretty cheap wind power on windy day or sun power on sunny days. The customers in our neighboring states, they love it. The generators, they hate it. It's funny to see. Sometimes the governments love it and sometimes they don't like it. So that gives an impression where the government stands. We also try to integrate the renewables more and more in the market. Already, For 2 years, as I explained, the renewables sell directly their energy to the wholesale market, and they get a kind of market premium. That means that renewables will only produce when the energy can be sold, and not they follow the demand, and they do not produce whatever they can. We also integrate the renewables more and more in the ancillary services, as I also said before. Voltage control, for example, by wind power is today normal, and renewable energies, of course, are able to stabilize the system when the sun is shining or the wind is blowing. They can offer frequency control or control power, as we call it. By that, we reduce step by step the so-called conventional must-run capacity, which allows then a higher share of renewables to be integrated in the system. That's what it is about, to keep stability and renewables together. What makes us confident that we will master the next phase? David has given one of my examples, but I have two. The sun eclipse. The sun eclipse was an interesting one. The numbers you have already mentioned, but we decided that the market is able and the market is flexible enough to cope with this situation. We prepared us very well, and we prepared the market very well. So we informed the market. We tried to educate the market as good as possible, and it worked well, not only in Germany, in whole Europe. We had another example which I want to mention. Actually, an example which was not so positive. 2 years ago, we had in a early spring, 3 days, there was photovoltaic forecasted with roughly 20 gigawatt production. And the system works like that the energy is sold on the day ahead market the first time and then only adjusted on the next day. So 20 gigawatt of photovoltaic had been sold to the market in the evening for the next day, and the market relied on this. And we had to learn within the night that there was a fog layer all over Germany which did not disappear, resulting in a generation up to 9,000 gigawatt lower than expected. That was on the early phase of integrating solar power. I hope this mistake will never happen again. We managed that, but 8,800 gigawatt. We found that out 2 hours before real time. So to activate 8,800 megawatts, nearly 9,000 megawatts in 2 hours, that's a big challenge. Only with the help of our neighboring states we were able to do that. So that is an example of what really has to be learned by integrating renewables. Another question I often get is, what does the energy transition mean for market players? Renewables are a complete game changer. New business models arise, for example, the Tesla battery here in California. We visited Tesla, was fine. Auke wanted to take his one back to Europe, but it's not ready yet. And new players come on the market. Some old players, some old business models disappear. For example, the lignite business model will most likely not be there long time anymore. Conventional plants heavily suffer in Europe from the low energy wholesale prices due to the renewables. Former huge integrated utilities split. You may have heard about the E.ON story. Some of them will disappear, some of them will survive. But the transformation offers also a lot of new opportunities for new players, and I'm sure these opportunities will be grasped by somebody, they will be taken by somebody, and there will be new, very interesting companies in the future. I see here today a couple of policymakers and regulators, so let me point out, those evolutions require, of course, innovative solutions, but also an appropriate legal and regulatory framework. And our experience is this is one of the major success factors, and the time how regulation has to follow the real development is very, very short. So it's also a very dynamic and challenging process for the regulators and for the policymakers. And what happens worldwide in terms of the energy transition? We are happy to be here in a region with a very dynamic program. California set up ambitious targets for the upcoming years, and I'm very impressed of this. But we also have many visitors from Middle East coming to us They start now with ambitious programs to develop renewables. And you have seen one number from Michael Liebreich, this 5-cent auction. I think that was one auction, 5 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour for PV was an auction in Middle East. China is now heavily developing renewables with a very high pace. India kicks off impressive national programs. Germany supports that a lot. When I hear about the pledges of many countries ahead of the upcoming COP21, I'm confident we will have a breakthrough this year in Paris and a firm commitment to reduce emissions and to develop renewables. Let's press our thumbs for Paris that is a successful event. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not only Europe and California. It has become a worldwide movement. Last but not least, let me highlight the importance of a collaborative approach to master this transition. Many stakeholders are needed to make it a success. Firstly, we have to cooperate much more intensively amongst transmission, distribution, demand, and generation. Secondly, regional cooperation to get the best out of the geographic diversity is needed if you want to raise efficiently the penetration level of renewables. And this event, I'm very impressed of this event today from ISO organized, so congratulations for this event. It's exactly what is needed there. Thirdly, public acceptance is more important than ever. Nobody can drive the energy transition against public opinion. Our citizens must be involved into this journey. And the energy transition has some consequences like new grids or wind farms in our neighborhood. There's an interesting element there. Public surveys in Europe and especially in Germany show the following picture. When you ask the question, do you like the energy transition in general? 80% say, we are behind it, we want it. When you ask the second question, are you willing to pay for it? It goes down to 60%. And when you say, well, do you accept new lines or windmills in your immediate surrounding, it goes down to 20%. Ladies and gentlemen, it's our task to deal with this dilemma. We TSOs and ISOs are more challenged as good communicators and servants of the society as ever before. And once again, I'm heavily impressed of what California ISO is doing here. To convince people, we have to be more transparent, more open to dialogue, and to better explain the story behind renewables and grids. As TSO, we have to respect environmental standards and to develop local projects compensating our impact on nature and landscape. That's why we have set up in Europe the Renewable Grid Initiative, RGI, together with a lot of NGO partners a couple of years ago. European NGOs and TSOs advocate now for, on the one side, the necessary grid development to integrate more and more renewables, while, on the other side, respecting at the same time nature protection standards and procedures. Dear ladies and gentlemen, California is going an ambitious and inspiring way in its energy transition. I feel honored to discover and to discuss it with all the experts and leaders in these days here in Sacramento. Despite some differences between California and Europe, I also see many similarities concerning the commitment to renewables, concerning climate policy, concerning dialogue procedures with stakeholders, and concerning the need for more cooperation. I have already learned a lot during this trip in California. No one of us has the silver bullet, nor the master plan. That's why it's so important to learn from each other, to understand what problems do the other regions have. After 3 days of intensive exchange of experience and thoughts, I will travel back with many inspirations and valuable insights for the next phases of the energy transition in Europe. Many thanks to you, Dave, to you, Steve, and the whole Californian ISO team, to Angelina and Antonella for organizing this impressive trip. Thanks a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, 10 years ago, we could not imagine integrating safely more than 5% renewables. Today, California and Europe show that 30 to 40% are feasible. We are on a joint journey to further push back the limits and further increase the shares of renewables. We have to think broader, we have to drive innovation, and I can just encourage you all to see and grasp the opportunities of this transition. Thank you for having me tonight here, for listening so patiently to my thoughts. I wish us all a very nice evening and fruitful discussions and a memorable event. Thank you very much.
Boris, that was more than terrific. We appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us and telling us about the story in Europe, and certainly it's a shared path that we travel. For today, we're done. I will make a couple of notes real quickly. I did have the opportunity, though, to break bread, to have dinner with the Pope's friend, Mike Florio, though, so... Mike he said he would be in a confessional out in the hallway. He's willing to list that. So thanks for being a good sport, Mike. Anyway. Look, for tomorrow, I think you'll enjoy the day. Hopefully you'll come back. I think there's some terrific things. We're raffling off a Tesla. But you have to be here to win. But we do have two incredible panels. You heard from Boris tonight. We have first a panel of senior leadership, much like Boris, on panel one. And Angelina Badanella. Sorry. Anyway, if you haven't met Antonella, she might make Michael Lieberich look shy. So I think you'll appreciate that. And then Michael is going to come back and he's going to moderate a second panel, which is with European regulators. So I think they'll both be interesting discussions. I know they'll both be interesting discussions. Come back tomorrow. 9 o'clock is when we start, and we'll be done by noon. So it'll be an action-packed time, and Antonella will certainly make sure I work on your last name tonight. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.